Okay, so get this. We're diving deep today into Vietnamese education policy, specifically their take on extra classes for students.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we found this 2024 circular from their Ministry of Education.
Okay.
And honestly, it's like way more interesting than I thought it would be.
Really?
Yeah, it's like we get to peek behind the curtain and see how another country tries to find that balance between, academic rigor and just letting kids be kids.
Well, it's always a tough one.
Right. So, what really struck me right off the bat was how much they emphasized the voluntary nature of these extra classes.
Yeah, it's interesting. The circular really stresses that these classes are only for students who actually need them.
Hmm.
A&D want to be there. Like they have to have a genuine desire to learn more. It's not about forcing anyone into anything.
Yeah, no pressure allowed. It's like they're saying, hey, academics are important, but not at the cost of childhood.
Right.
It makes you wonder if maybe there's been some pushback against, really intense academic pressure in Vietnam.
That's a really good point. And they don't stop there. The circular goes on to emphasize the importance of quality in these extra classes. They want to make sure that they don't negatively impact regular schooling or, even more importantly, the kids' health.
Wow, so they're not just saying no pressure. They're also saying even if you do have these extra classes, they need to be done right. They're setting some serious ground rules here.
They really are.
So how does all of this actually work in practice, though? Are we talking about extra classes offered within the schools themselves, or are we talking about like these private centers that are popping up everywhere?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The circular actually makes a distinction between supplemental education that happens within schools and the programs offered by private organizations. They each have their own sets of guidelines.
Oh, okay. So let's break those down then, starting with the in-school programs. Who exactly are those designed for, and what are the main rules that apply?
Sure. So the in-school extra classes are specifically designed for three types of students. First, you have those who might be falling behind a bit in their studies, and they need a little extra support to catch up. Then there are students who are preparing for academic competitions, like those intense math Olympiads and things like that.
Wow, yeah.
And then finally, you have extra classes that are geared towards students who are preparing for major exams, like their university entrance exams.
Okay, so it's a very targeted approach then, focused on specific needs and goals.
Exactly.
Which actually begs the question, what about cost? Are parents expected to pay for these in-school programs?
This is the surprising part. The in-school extra classes are completely free.
Hmm.
The government actually covers the costs for these.
Wow, no kidding. So they're really putting their money where their mouth is then when it comes to educational equity.
Absolutely. They're demonstrating a real commitment to making sure that every student has access to the support they need.
That's pretty impressive.
Uh,
Okay, but what about the out-of-school private centers then? Are those basically a free-for-all?
Not at all. Not even close. The circular has a whole section dedicated to outlining the rules for private organizations that offer supplemental education. And let me tell you, they don't mess around.
Okay, so what are some of the key regulations for these private centers?
Well, first and foremost, they have to be officially registered as businesses, which, comes with a whole set of standards and legal obligations.
Right, so right off the bat, they're establishing that baseline of accountability, making sure that these are legitimate operations.
Exactly. And then on top of that, they have to meet a whole bunch of requirements aimed at transparency.
Okay, in what way?
Like, picture this.
Yes.
There's a public list that has to be maintained with every single extra class option in your area. Their schedules, teacher qualifications, even their fees. Talk about open book.
Wow, that's incredible. That gives so much power to the parents, right?
Exactly. Parents can compare options, check out the teachers' backgrounds, and make informed choices for their kids.
It also incentivizes the private centers to really up their game if they want to attract students.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
creates healthy competition.
So everyone wins. But what about the teachers themselves, though? What happens if, let's say, a public school teacher wants to moonlight at one of these private centers?
That's a good question, because it seems like there could be some potential conflicts of interest there, right?
Right.
Well, the circular addresses that directly. Public school teachers are actually allowed to teach extra classes outside of the regular school hours.
Hey, there's always a but.
There is. They have to inform their principal and get approval first.
Makes sense. They have to make sure that their side hustle isn't interfering with their main gig.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining those boundaries and ensuring that everyone's priorities are straight.
So anything else about the teachers that jumps out at you?
Well, there is one point that I found particularly interesting and potentially a bit controversial. The circular states that while public school teachers can teach extra classes, They are not allowed to be involved in the management or administration of these private centers.
Oh, wow. So, like, they can teach, but they can't be calling any shots.
Right. It's like they're trying to draw a very clear line in the sand there.
Yeah, I wonder what the reasoning is behind that.
I think it's about preventing conflicts of interest and making sure that the focus of public school teachers stays on their primary role within the public education system.
Hmm. It's a tricky balance, though, right? Like, you want to allow teachers to supplement their income if they choose to,
You do.
but you also don't want to create a situation where they're being pulled in too many different directions or their commitment to their school gets compromised.
It's definitely a complex issue with valid points on both sides.
Definitely something to think about. And speaking of different spheres, how does the circular address the funding side of things?
Oh, good question, because funding can get messy, especially when you have both public and private entities involved.
Yeah.
Well, they've tried to set up a pretty clear system. As we mentioned before, the government fully funds those in-school extra classes, keeping them free for students.
Right, which makes sense given their emphasis on equity.
Exactly. But when it comes to the private centers, it's a completely different model. It's basically a fee-for-service model.
Okay, so how does that work?
Parents and the private centers directly negotiate the fees, taking into account things like the specific subject, the teacher's experience, the level of instruction provided. It's essentially a market-driven system.
Oh, so it's all about freedom of choice then, letting the market dynamics play out.
Pretty much. But, of course, that raises the issue of accountability, right?
Oh, of course. Because how do you ensure transparency with these financial transactions when you have all these different players setting their own prices?
Well, that's where the regulations come back into play. The circular mandates that private centers have to be totally upfront about their fees. They need to provide receipts, and they need to maintain detailed financial records. It's all about keeping things above board and preventing any shady business from happening.
That's good to hear. Because transparency really is key, right?
It is. It builds trust, and it helps to ensure that everyone is playing by the rules.
But here's the big question. How effectively are all these rules actually enforced in reality?
Ah, you've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Having a beautifully written policy document is one thing, but actually making sure those rules are followed on the ground is a whole other challenge.
Exactly. Because I imagine there are all sorts of factors that could impact implementation, right? Like the capacity of the regulatory bodies, the cultural nuances that might influence how those rules are interpreted and applied is a whole other layer of complexity.
You're absolutely right. It's the age-old challenge of translating policy into practice.
It's like the difference between reading a recipe and actually cooking the dish, right? You
Mhm.
need both the ingredients AD, a deep understanding of the process to get the desired outcome.
Such a good analogy.
So I'm really curious to dig into that next layer then, to explore how these rules actually play out in real life and what kind of impact they're having on the ground.
Well, you're in luck, because that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. Buckle up, everyone. It's about to get real.
It is. So welcome back to our deep dive into Vietnamese education policy.
Hmm.
You know, when we left off, we were talking about how the circular sets up this really intricate web of accountability.
Yeah, it's pretty complex.
It is. But it makes sense when you think about all the different players involved,
Right.
right? It's not just the Ministry of Education calling all the shots.
Definitely not. You've got government bodies, schools, private centers, even the local communities. It's like a whole ecosystem.
It is. And to really understand how it works,
Mm.
we need to break down the roles of each player. So let's start with the provincial governments.
Okay, so like what's their role in all of this?
Well, they're kind of like the conductors of the orchestra, right? They have the ultimate responsibility for managing education in their respective provinces.
So they're making sure that everything's running smoothly, that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, they oversee things like resource allocation. They make sure that both public and private supplemental education initiatives get the support they need.
So they're the big picture thinkers, the strategists.
You got it. But then you need someone to handle the day-to-day operations.
Right.
Someone to translate those big policy goals into concrete actions.
Right. So who's in charge of that?
That's where the education departments come in.
Ah.
They work directly with the schools and the private centers,
Mhm.
make sure everyone's following the rules, providing quality instruction, operating transparently.
So it sounds like a pretty hands-on role. Are they just advisors, or do they actually have the power to enforce these regulations?
Oh, no, they definitely have teeth.
Mhm.
They can conduct inspections, review financial records, investigate any complaints that come up, and if they find a violation, they can issue warnings, fines,
Nice.
even recommend more serious actions.
Wow, so they're not messing around.
Nope, they're the enforcers, making sure everyone stays in line.
Okay, so we've got the provincial governments, the education departments. What about the schools themselves? What are their responsibilities in all of this?
Well, the principals are key players here, right? They're the ones who are responsible for managing those in-school extra classes.
Yeah.
They have to make sure that they're well organized, staffed with qualified teachers, and actually meeting the needs of the students.
Yeah, they're the ones who know their students best.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about public school teachers being allowed to teach extra classes outside of school?
Uh-huh.
Well, the principal has to approve that first.
Right.
They need to make sure that those side gigs aren't interfering with the teacher's main duties or creating any conflicts of interest.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance again.
It is.
Okay, so what about the private supplemental education centers then? What are their main responsibilities under this circular?
Well, they have a lot of freedom in some ways, but they also have to follow some pretty strict rules. The first thing is that they need to be registered as legitimate businesses.
Ah, so that establishes that baseline level of accountability.
Exactly. And then they have to be really transparent.
Hmm.
Disclose all kinds of information about their classes, schedules, teacher qualifications, fees, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, so parents really have a lot of information at their fingertips.
They do.
Yeah.
It's all about empowering them to make informed decisions.
I like that. It creates a more level playing field. But with all this focus on regulations and oversight, do the students themselves have any say in all of this?
That's a great question. And the circular actually addresses that. It really emphasizes the fact that participation in supplemental education has to be voluntary.
Oh, good.
Students should only be enrolled if they genuinely want to be there, not because their parents are forcing them or anything like that.
That's really important because learning is so much more effective when it comes from a place of genuine interest. Really.
Absolutely. And it aligns with their whole focus on student well-being.
Yeah.
Recognizing that pushing kids too hard can be counterproductive.
So they've got all these checks and balances in place to ensure accountability, fairness. But what happens if someone actually breaks the rules? Who steps in to enforce the consequences?
Well, that's where all those different layers of accountability come into play, right? The provincial governments have that overarching oversight. The education departments are the ones on the ground doing the monitoring. Schools are responsible for their teachers. Private centers have to meet their own standards.
It's like a team effort.
It is. But it's not just about government agencies.
Huh.
The circular also talks about community involvement.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they actually encourage community members to report any concerns they might have, whether it's about noise levels, safety issues, or even suspicions of unethical practices. They want people to speak up.
That's a really smart move because it creates that sense of shared responsibility.
Exactly.
So they've created this whole ecosystem, a very comprehensive approach to regulating supplemental education. But as we've been saying, the real test is in the implementation. How does all of this actually play out in practice?
What's the million-dollar question? And that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We're going to move from the theoretical framework to the messy realities on the ground.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts really laying out all the roles in this Vietnamese supplemental education system.
We have.
It's a pretty impressive framework, honestly.
It is very thorough.
But you know what they say, the proof is in the pudding.
Always.
So how does this whole system actually work in the real world?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's one thing to have a beautifully written policy document. It's another thing entirely to see it actually making a difference in people's lives.
Exactly. So let's shift gears a bit from theory to reality. What are some of the things that are working well, and what are some of the bumps in the road they've encountered along the way?
Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is the potential for uneven enforcement. Vietnam's a diverse country with a wide range of socioeconomic conditions.
Right. So you're saying that the capacity to implement these regulations might differ from one place to the next.
Exactly. You could have some provinces where the education departments are well-staffed, well-funded, community involvement is strong, and the rules are being followed really closely. But then you might have other areas where resources are scarce. Oversight is weaker, and compliance becomes more of a challenge.
And that could lead to some pretty significant disparities, right?
Oh, absolutely. Some students might be benefiting from a really robust system, while others might be facing, greater risks. Subpar instruction exploitation, even limited opportunities.
It really highlights the fact that even with the best of intentions, policy implementation is never a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
It's so true. Local context always matters.
What other challenges do you think they might be grappling with?
Well, another one that comes to mind is that delicate dance between public and private education. You know, the circular aims to create a level playing field, but there's always the potential for friction between those two spheres.
Oh, I can see that happening. Public schools might feel pressure to compete with the private centers that have more flexibility in setting their fees and catering to certain
Right.
demands.
It could even lead to a sort of two-tiered system, where those who can afford it opt for the private centers, and those who can't are left with the public options.
Which would obviously raise concerns about equity.
Exactly. And that's something the policymakers really need to keep a close eye on, to make sure the regulations aren't inadvertently creating any disadvantages for certain groups.
It's a constant balancing act for sure.
It is. But let's not just focus on the challenges. There are also a lot of potential successes and lessons to be learned from Vietnam's approach.
Oh, totally. What are some of the things you think they're doing really well?
Well, their commitment to transparency is definitely worth highlighting. I mean, that requirement for private centers to publicly disclose all that information about their classes, that's huge.
It really empowers parents, right?
Absolutely. It allows them to make informed choices, and it holds those centers accountable.
So everyone wins. And what about the community oversight aspect? How do you think that's playing out?
I think it's a really smart move. By encouraging local residents to be active participants in the monitoring process, they're creating a much more responsive and inclusive system.
It's like they're saying, we all have a stake in this.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening. It really makes you realize that education policy is about so much more than just, rules on a page.
It really does. It's a reflection of a society's values and priorities.
And what are some of those values that you see reflected in Vietnam's approach?
Well, I see a deep commitment to providing a quality education for all children, a strong emphasis on regulation and accountability, and a desire to find that balance between academic rigor and the well-being of students.
It's inspiring to see a nation grappling with these complex issues and striving to create a system that truly serves the best interests of its people.
Absolutely. And while there will always be challenges and areas for improvement, I think Vietnam's approach offers some valuable lessons for all of us as we navigate the ever-evolving world of education.
It's a reminder that learning is a continuous process of exploration, adaptation, refinement.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And that's what we try to do here on The Deep Dive, to explore complex topics to spark thoughtful conversations, and to empower you, our listeners, to engage with the world in a more informed and insightful way.
So until next time, keep those minds curious, keep those questions flowing.
And remember, the quest for knowledge is always better together.
See you on the next Deep Dive.
Bye, everyone!